In this corner, we have the ruler of rolling starts Daytona USA, the arcade smash hit that was destined to become the Saturn's first killer app. In the other corner, we have Ridge Racer, the PlayStation launch game from Namco that was ready to compete. These two racing games represented the first major battle in the 32-bit console war and pit the Sega Saturn against the Sony PlayStation. But what did the critics say 29 years ago? Was it hotly contested, or was there a clear winner in this 5th generation showdown? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Computer and Video Games, Die Hard Game Fan, and more classic magazines that reviewed both of these racers back when they first came out. Today we're going to see where the critics landed and maybe, just maybe, settle this debate once and for all. Watch yourself, the next corner's tough because this is going to be a speedy episode of Magazine Matchup.
Welcome to the theater of the eye.
Rods and cones report to the orbital socket.
How nice. We're trimming the toenails. What's that?
Optic nerve. This is the brain. What's going on down there?
The eardrum's going up! Go get help!
We're having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown, having a breakdown, we're having a breakdown.
What else can go wrong?
Urgent synapse on line 2. It's the sphincter.
What is going on up there?
Sega Saturn.
While racing games have always been a staple of console gaming, they took a new importance at the dawn of the 32-bit era. Thanks to consoles like the PlayStation and the Saturn finally having the horsepower to display polygonal graphics, we started to see 3D racing games that far exceeded the Mode 7 effects that we were used to on the Super Nintendo. This set up the first major battle between these two 32-bit systems, Ridge Racer versus Daytona USA. I was sure there were plenty of other games that launched on both systems, but honestly, this was the only matchup that any of the magazines cared about. It was two titans of the arcade putting their best foot forward to show off the power of the next generation. Let's see who came out on top. When it comes to Electronic Gaming Monthly, they let the Iceman and Video Cowboy of the sports division review these two racers. Daytona USA was the first one out of the gate, dropping day and date with the surprise launch of the Saturn back on May 11th, 1995. The Iceman was, underwhelmed. It's finally here, a surprise for everyone stateside. The quality of the game, mainly in the graphics, is quite noticeable from the arcade version. The scaling and scrolling of the tracks need more animation. It was disappointing to watch at first, but when you get started, you won't want to get off the wheel. The overall performance of this translation is well done. It needs some tweaking. EGM gave Daytona USA an average score of 7.8 out of 10. Fast forward 2 issues, and it's time for Ridge Racer to compete, and it turned out to be a real blowout. Electronic Gaming Monthly went almost a full point higher, giving this PlayStation launch game an average score of 8.75 out of 10. The Iceman explained that ever since this came out on the PlayStation, I haven't had to go back to the arcades. You'll get the same feeling, and you won't have to worry about quarters. All the tracks and then some are here, as well as killer music that sets the tone for the game. From every S-turn to the final straightaway, the intense racing never ends. This could be the best racer of the year. Sadly, EGM didn't have a Best Racer of the Year award, so we're just gonna have to go by the score. And when we use that metric, the result is clear: the PlayStation takes the first point. Over at Computer and Video Games, they ended up reviewing the two racers in the opposite order. Let's see if maybe that makes a difference to the outcome. In their 159th issue, CVG gave Ridge Racer a 96%, one of the highest scores they gave any game in 1995. Who needs arcades anymore? Well, we still do. As impressed as I am at Ridge Racer on the home machine, it is a game that I've seen before and played in the arcade. But, and I felt the same way about Virtua Fighter, it seems to play a whole lot better when you're not coughing up 1 pound to go. Technically, it's magnificent. And with the mirror mode and plenty of hidden features, any doubt about the long-term appeal are quickly dispelled. Let's just hope that we start seeing original software of this quality, but this will definitely do for now. Now, I say that 96% is one of the highest scores of 1995 because that's also the same score that CVG gave Daytona USA. Daytona drives like a dream, which is why it's a winner. Playability alone won't sell a next-generation machine. Just look at Tempest on the Jag. So, games on your Saturns and PlayStations have to look state-of-the-art. Although the clipping somewhat lets it down, the rest of Daytona's graphics are sublime. The competitive racing element is pitched just right, and once you pick up the joypad, you'll be after personal best from the word go. Now, hang on, wait a second. Tempest 2000 looked great. I'd argue that visually, that holds up way better than most of the first-generation 32-bit games. But hey, maybe that's not the point. Here we have a tie, which means that the Saturn is finally on the board, even if they are still behind 2-1. Alright, I hate to spoil the winner right out of the gate, but Next Generation gives us our second and final tie of the day, with both Daytona USA and Ridge Racer earning scores of 4 out of 5. Now that we have that out of the way, let's go ahead and start with the PlayStation game, where they said this. While the jury may still be out in the Ridge Racer vs. Daytona USA battle for arcade supremacy, there's no disputing that for a home title, Namco just scored a home run for the PlayStation. The graphics really do have to be seen to be believed. And when you consider that this is effectively a last-minute rush job, it's a fantastic testament to the PlayStation's potential power. On the downside, it lacks a 2-player mode. Also, the cars don't really vary that much in feel and performance, but otherwise, a fine game and an excellent harbinger of what's to come. Now, when it comes to Daytona USA, you better believe that they framed it as a console war showdown between these two massive racers. If it weren't for Ridge Racer, there's little doubt that Daytona USA would have been regarded as the ultimate next-generation racing game. But, unfortunately for Sega, Namco nipped it in the bud, and Daytona now has a formidable adversary with which to contend. In an effort to keep up with its arch-rival, Sega has concentrated on maintaining Daytona's graphic detail. With the low resolution, relative lack of colors, and less than silky update hampers any chances of an overwhelming first impression. While Daytona USA suffers from an accumulation of weaknesses, if it's a fast, thrilling racing game you're after, the Saturn conversion has a great deal to recommend. The good news is, we're done with ties. With a score of 3-2, it's time to cross the Atlantic to see what Next Generation Sister Magazine said, which is coming up right after this short break.
Bad. Bad.
ハードと新作ソフトでクールパッドプレゼント。
Sega Saturn.
Now, maybe it's because they have a more robust rating scale to work with, or perhaps the Brits are just a little bit more decisive, but Edge definitely settled the tie. Let's once again start with Ridge Racer, just for fun. When Edge reviewed this PlayStation launch game in their 17th issue, they complained about the lack of long-lasting challenge, but ultimately gave it a 9 out of 10. After its half-year journey onto the PlayStation, Ridge Racer has managed to fulfill almost all expectations. This achievement is all the more remarkable when you consider the price of the game in Japan, a mere £37. From the brief but perfect game of Galaxian you can play while the game boots up, to the dazzling graphics and arcade-perfect music and speech, Ridge Racer is the killer app that Namco and Sony can be proud of. And this is just the beginning! Now, hang on a second, could it be that Edge actually went higher than a 9 out of 10 when scoring Daytona USA? Nope. As you might have already guessed, They went lower, going with an 8 out of 10. Although AM2 managed to replicate the coin-op tolerably well, Saturn Daytona fails to capture the arcade experience that PlayStation Ridge Racer so convincingly delivers. Although there's no single factor that cripples it, the game suffers from an accumulation of niggles that ensure that it never quite manages to fulfill its enormous potential. If you're expecting an arcade-perfect conversion, you'll be slightly disappointed. But if it's fast, thrilling racing you're after, Daytona USA has a great deal to recommend it. Wait, hang on. That's word for word exactly the same thing the Next Generation said about that game. And you know, now that I mention it, didn't the exact same thing happen in the last episode? What's going on here? Look, it could be that both the Edge and Next Generation reviews were written by the same person. But since neither magazine publishes the critic's name, we're never gonna know. Yeah, that's a little frustrating, to say the least. Either way, Ridge Racer is starting to pull ahead with a score of 4-2. One of the magazines that we talk about a lot in this matchup series is a German publication simply titled VideoGames. Today we're going to check in with a different video games magazine, one with a far more boastful name, and that is the Ultimate Gaming Magazine. Yeah, sure, whatever guys. Let's just see what they said about Daytona USA, where they gave it an 8 out of 10 and anticlimactically chose a winner. The big question that everybody's gonna ask is, how does Daytona on the Sega Saturn compare to Ridge Racer on the Sony PlayStation? Well, I must be honest, Ridge Racer is superior, if only for the control and the smooth 30 frames per second animation. Daytona USA is still a very good racing game with a few minor flaws. Now, when it comes to Ridge Racer, VideoGames, the Ultimate Gaming Magazine, didn't just fall in love with the game, they gave it their highest score possible, a 10 out of 10. In Wipeout and other such upcoming PlayStation titles, Ridge Racer's influence on the gaming world is already being felt. Atari's pole position defined the driving simulation standard for over 10 years. Now, with Ridge Racer, the torch has been passed to a new generation of games. Yeah, this matchup wasn't even close, and neither is the score so far. Ridge Racer has 5, while Daytona USA lags far behind with 2. Let me tell you, it's time for Sega to really rally with these last few magazines if they want to stand a chance. Die-hard game fan always has something interesting or crazy to say, so let's go ahead and see where they landed on Daytona USA. While the reviews were definitely strong with an average score of 88%, you can tell that the editors were a little disappointed. Nick Rock sums it up perfectly. I have to be honest, I was expecting more from Daytona. Not to say it isn't an excellent title, which it undeniably is, but the Saturn is capable of much more. While the gameplay remains 100% exact to the arcade version and the hyper-catchy B-Univ arcade tunes have been arranged to perfection, the disturbing object pop-up and slow frame rate are extremely noticeable and detract from the overall experience. Daytona arcade fans will likely spasm with joy on receiving their game at home, but if you're just looking for a thrilling 3D ride, you should probably stick with Panzer. Now let's compare that to Ridge Racer, which the magazine gave an average score of 92%. For his part, Nick Rocks actually went higher than the average, giving it a 98%. He used 3 words to sum up his thoughts: joy, power, and force. That's Ridge Racer. Perfect graphics, perfect music, and perfect gameplay easily balance out only one track, for me at least. It may seem like madness, but I simply never get bored of Ridge Racer. I could play it forever. Look, I love Ridge Racer, but that's not a claim I think that Nick is going to be able to back up. But hey, the veracity doesn't matter because the PlayStation yet again gets a point. Oh man, the score sits at 6-2. With only 3 more magazines to look at, we're now at the point where Daytona USA simply cannot catch up. So instead of making this episode even longer, let's just jump into the speed round and finish this off with a bang. Starting with Australia's own Hyper, which gave Ridge Racer a 92%, the same score we saw from GameFan. Daytona, on the other hand, stalled with an 86%. If you expected a different result from the land down under, then you'd be wrong. Yeah, that's right, the PlayStation gets another point. Things aren't that much different over at GamePro, who were notorious for handing out high scores, whether the game deserved them or not. In this case, Daytona USA earned a 4.5 out of 5. Look, I think we can all agree that that is a phenomenal score, but of course it's no match for Ridge Racer, which finished with a 5 out of 5. The PlayStation Racer ended up being GamePro's favorite racing game of the year. And finally, we're going to close out this episode with the closest matchup of them all, which came from the recently shuttered Game Informer. They gave Ridge Racer a score of 9 out of 10, while Daytona isn't really that far behind with an average score of 8.75 out of 10. That's just a quarter of a point difference. I mean, the PlayStation still takes the point, but you gotta admit that that's at least a close race. When we look at the final score, I tell you, this is just a real blowout. Ridge Racer took the early lead, and they just never gave it up. With a score of 9-2, Sega's arcade racer just didn't even stand a chance. No magazine preferred it over what Namco came up with, and even when there was a tie score, the sentiment expressed inside of the reviews preferred Ridge Racer over Daytona. I mean, perhaps you disagree, but this was 100% where the mindset was in 1995, at least amongst the critics. Here's hoping that the next magazine matchup is a little bit more competitive.
Oh, 今日からゲームが変わる。ゲームの塊、プレイステーション。出た。
Hey, thanks for watching me match up these magazines. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we've posted a bunch of similar episodes throughout this year, including Aladdin vs. Aladdin, Super Mario World vs. Sonic the Hedgehog, and Turtles in Time vs. the Hyperstone Heist. That last one's just a few weeks old, so definitely go and give it some love. We're going to be back soon with another matchup. But for now, here's the question I have for you. Which is better, Ridge Racer or Daytona USA? I mean, the critics definitely preferred Ridge Racer, but I have a hunch that there are a lot of Sega fans out there who beg to differ. Are you one of them? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we'll be back later this week with more reviews and a review crew episode, probably about Donkey Kong Land 3. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.